On August 25, 1944, American bombers on a reconnaissance mission flew towards southern Poland. They had been sent to photograph the synthetic oil plant at the Monowitz forced labor camp. During this mission, they inadvertently took photos of another concentration camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, adjacent to the Monowitz facility. These photographs show two distinct black buildings, along with large groups of people being led towards them. These photographs turned out to be the first solid evidence that the Nazis were engaged in a systematic program to annihilate whole subpopulations whom they considered undesirable: gypsies, homosexuals, Poles, and Jews. These photographs and other evidence leave us with the question: could it have been stopped? Given the overwhelming Allied military power in Europe in 1944, could this program of genocide have been ended? Could Auschwitz have been bombed? Here we will examine this question from multiple perspectives, the arguments for and against the idea, and to what extent those arguments were influenced by lack of awareness, bureaucratic inertia, or perhaps darker motivations. Reports of atrocities taking place in the Auschwitz complex first reached the Western Allies in 1941. A paper, The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-Occupied Poland, was presented by the Polish government in exile to the 26 Allies who had signed the Declaration by United Nations on January 1, 1942. Also, in 1942, Lieutenant Jan Karski, a Polish resistance fighter and diplomat who acted as a courier for the Polish government in exile, reported to the British and U.S. governments on the situation in occupied Poland, especially the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the general systematic extermination of the Poles and Jews nationally. In Britain, Karski met numerous political parties and also spoke with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary. He also traveled to the United States and met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In addition to this, from April 1942 to February 1943, radio messages sent by the German Order Police were intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. These messages included daily prisoner returns and death tolls for 10 concentration camps, including Auschwitz. There were also reports from a trickle of escapees. On June 20, 1942, Kazimierz Pociejski organized a daring escape from Auschwitz along with 3 fellow inmates. With them, they carried a report from Witold Pilecki, an inmate who had spent a total of 945 days at the camp. A Polish army captain, he is the only person to volunteer to be imprisoned at Auschwitz. And on April 7, 1944, 2 young Jewish inmates, Rudolf Riba and Alfred Wetzler, escaped from the Auschwitz camp with detailed information about the camp's geography, the gas chambers, and the numbers being killed. This information, later compiled into the Riba-Wetzler report, reached the Jewish community in Budapest no later than April 27th. Roswell McClellan, the U.S. War Refugee Board representative in Switzerland, received a copy by mid-June, and information based on the report was broadcast on June 15th by the BBC and on June 20th published by the New York Times. After learning in June 1944 that Auschwitz was in fact a death camp, David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem appealed to U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to bomb the camp and the train tracks leading to the camp, reversing their previous position. President Roosevelt, aware of the importance of his Jewish constituency, consulted with Jewish leaders. These recommendations were totally rejected by leading Jewish organizations. He deferred to their advice to not emphasize the Holocaust as it might incite anti-Semitism in the U.S. According to historians Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman, after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and his military and diplomatic advisors sought to unite the nation and blunt Nazi propaganda by avoiding the appearance of fighting a war for the Jews. In England, Prime Minister Winston Churchill did not see bombing as a solution, given that bombers were inaccurate and would also kill prisoners on the ground. And the British Air Ministry, after examining the feasibility of bombing the camps, decided not to for operational reasons, which were never specified. The issue of bombing Auschwitz-Birkenau first gained widespread prominence in the late 1970s, with the publication in Commentary of the article Why Auschwitz Was Never Bombed by historian David S. Wyman. In the article, Wyman presented 4 possible scenarios for attacking the Birkenau crematoria, or the rail lines leading to them. 1. A diversion of U.S. B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers from IG Farman to the crematoria. 2. The employment of 2-engine B-25 medium bombers, which would presumably bomb more accurately from a lower altitude. 3. A dive bombing raid by 2-engine P-38 fighters, similar to a raid carried out by the U.S. Army Air Force on the Romanian oil complex of Poloetsi on June 10, 1944. 4. A special mission by Royal Air Force Mosquito 2-engine bombers, like the ones executed against Gestapo prisons and headquarters in Western Europe. In 1979, CIA photo analysts Dino Bragiani and Robert Poirier reinforced Wyman's arguments. They presented dramatic aerial reconnaissance photos of Auschwitz taken by Allied aircraft in 1944 and early 1945. These photos show prisoners being marched to the gas chambers. However, these photos used magnification techniques unavailable to Allied photo interpreters 35 years earlier. Although Allied intelligence had photos of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, they were ignored because no priority was placed on a bombing mission. In addition, camps were viewed only as places to avoid in an attack. Retired physician Richard Foreger wrote the first article against the Wyman theses in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, James Kitchens, an Air Force archivist, and Richard Levy, a retired engineer, published articles in scholarly journals criticizing Wyman's theses. Their criticisms of Wyman's argument were: 1. In World War II, heavy bombers had an extremely poor bombing accuracy. A raid on Birkenau might have killed innumerable prisoners, while failing to put the crematoria out of order. 2. B-25s had insufficient range and accuracy, and, in fact, the P-38 raid on Ploetsi was a disaster. The U.S. Army Air Force would hardly have been inclined to repeat such an operation. 3. Wyman consistently underestimated the effectiveness of German fighter and anti-aircraft artillery defenses and overestimated Allied intelligence knowledge of Auschwitz-Birkenau. 4. Destroying rail lines through bombing was difficult, especially from high-altitude bombers, and any resulting damage was easily repaired. 5. RAF Mosquitoes in the Mediterranean theater were not suited for such a precision raid, and elite squadrons, then being used for raids in Northern Europe, would not likely have been diverted south for such a mission. However, Stuart Erdheim, a theologian and filmmaker, defended Wyman, responding in detail to these criticisms. And U.S. Air Force officer Ronald Rice independently published a detailed analysis of bombing accuracy and types of missions, which argued for the feasibility of an operation against the Birkenau crematoria. On the other hand, in 2002, after examining actual and hypothetical responses of the Auschwitz SS to air raids, historians Joseph Robert White concluded they would likely have found ways to continue the killing, even after the complete destruction of the Birkenau crematoria complexes. Although the debate is hypothetical and can never be settled, a few conclusions can be reached. 1. A raid or raids on Birkenau were certainly feasible, but it is debatable whether such operations would have effectively destroyed the gas chambers, and what the cost would have been in prisoner lives. 2. Such raids were only possible in late spring 1944 at the earliest, at a rather late stage of the Holocaust. 3. Bombing railroads at the long ranges needed for such missions was indeed very unlikely to succeed. 4. The use of U.S. heavy bombers, which would have been a small diversion from operations being conducted by the U.S. Army Air Force in the summer of 1944, is a much more likely scenario than others presented by Wyman. 5. Sustained pressure from top Allied leaders, notably President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, would have been necessary to overcome the inertia of the Allied command structure, which was tasked with winning a gigantic war with resources that were always less than ideal. However, Roosevelt was always unsympathetic to the idea, and Churchill never showed any sustained interest. Ultimately, the failure to bomb Auschwitz epitomizes the Allied response to the Holocaust, being little more than public condemnations. Although it might not have saved many lives, a raid against Auschwitz would have been a powerful symbolic gesture. Deviant Knowledge tries to bring you history you were never taught and voices you never heard. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you appreciate little-known histories and non-mainstream perspectives, please consider subscribing. We're just starting out, and we're looking to build a community of fellow deviant heads.